Okay, here we are. Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you today. I have a very special guest, a good brother and a friend of mine. This is Evan Steiner. Evan and I, we met, well, it's almost 2 years ago now.
It's been a
And
while. Yeah.
we, we were in a mutual workshop together as participants. And we had a very wonderful connection with each other. And we've just grown to become really close heart allies, friends, and we love each other and we love what each other is doing. And to give some background with Evan, Evan has been very deeply involved with creating new economic models, new ways of governance, new ways of creating a world that's better, that's works for the whole. The term sometimes we use, I use, I learned from my brother Daniel Schmachtenberger is Omni-Win, meaning systems of governance, systems of finance, systems of economies that are good for the whole, good for Gaia, good for Mother Earth, good for everyone. And I know you've been on the forefront of that. So welcome, Evan Steiner. All right.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you, Sachin.
Brother, just give us a little background of who you are and what you've studied and what you're doing right now, please.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to communicate it is just I'll try to be succinct in my background. But I originally was studying music all through college, and then about halfway through college, started teaching environmental education, just kind of for fun and taking people into nature. And that really put me on the trajectory of really trying to understand a lot of the ecological issues and the climate issues that we were facing. And my inquiry has always been just really what's at the roots, like what's causing it very, very deep down below. And I started off in the sustainability space maybe like 15 years ago or so, working for different environmental startups. And I was there and I sort of said, well, it's business which is causing primarily most of the issues. And so I went and worked in this space of kind of business for good and social enterprise and impact investment. Worked there for a few years and had a similar kind of realization, which was that it just wasn't going deep enough. That even in the the edges of impact investment or conscious capitalism, that it was still largely the same economic type of ideas, but that with a kind of coat of paint or a kind of a framing around it, but that was not really deeply substantive. And so I started looking more at the economics and looking at new economic systems 7 or 8 years ago, and have really, because it felt more as like, if you look at environmental issues like climate change, it's not a climate issue, it's an economic issue. It's epiphenomena of an economic of a poorly structured economic system. So I started to delve into that area, and that's where I've been ever since. And it's a very tricky area to work because we just we have such a dominant economic system as it's currently structured, and so building and creating new models is feasible, but it's hard because there's huge power asymmetries, and it looks very different to do things holistically. And so, but that's what my inquiry has been for the past years, really what's at the roots.
Thank you, brother. You and I also have a deep love for spiritual, if you will, philosophies, yogic philosophy, spiritual attainment, wholeness as a human, wholeness as society. What brought you into that whole dimension of care and insight?
Well, originally, because I was not a functional person. Originally, it was, back in my early 20s, just trying to have some semblance of balance and coherence in my life, and really struggling at the time, and starting to get into yoga as kind of a response to that. And then I just wanted to go deeper into it as well. I went and lived at a yoga and health center for a bit and really started studying in much more depth. And but I mean, just to be honest, that's kind of what took me in. It was just being in a challenging place energetically. My father had just passed. I just like was not uh, in a healthy place. But the yoga and the spiritual path really helped me have a much more solid foundation. And then what I saw over time as well is that those modalities and those directions actually have more substantive understanding for the nature of how to inquire into truth, right? And tying that back into the work that I do, it's similar that economic structures, business structures, finance, all these things, if especially within economics, it should be an inquiry into truth. It's really like, what is actually real here? What is actually taking place versus a lot of ideology or a lot of story or a lot of just things that we're making up. Like, how are we actually inquiring into the real nature of our economic systems? And so I've just been interested in melding those two worlds because spirituality, kind of in addition to some of the scientific communities, really have in that integration point, they have much more developed methodologies of inquiring into real fundamental truth. And I think it's incredibly important right now, and that especially nowadays where there's so much misinformation, people are so confused, it's even more important than ever.
I'd like you to share about, through all your work and investigation, I've been in business all my life. I come from an entrepreneurial family going back generations from my father's side. My mother's side are all Gandhians and Gandhi family, and they're very much connected to service to humanity.
Yeah.
And, this can be a foundational or fundamental conflict in the way it's set up. I'd love to hear, what do you think is the major problem or the problem that we have with the current economic models from a macro level all the way to how we're doing it right here as individuals running our own small businesses?
Well, there's a lot of connections there.
And take your time on this because I think it's really valuable for people to know what's not working and what the ramifications are of, to our livelihood, our life. Forget our livelihood.
Well, I'll draw a few macro issues and then maybe try to bring it down more to individual people in their lives. I'll just give a couple macro. There's quite a number of macroeconomic issues. Some of them are more obvious, like, for example, the growth paradigm. The current economic structure is predicated on growth. And the mechanisms of that are kind of embedded within the financial sector. For example, interest rates on debt. Like, interest rates are things that's perpetuating growth. If you're not growing the economy, you can't service all this debt, and you can't service these interest rates. So it's embedded in the math, this kind of growth paradigm. But of course, we exist on a finite planet, and especially when growth is focused on an extraction of the ecological basis of the planet, it's not feasible over the long term. So the growth paradigm and moving from, there's a whole body of work and people out there that focus on post-growth scenarios or even degrowth, or the term that I like is growth agnosticism. So how are you having organizations that can grow and shrink and grow and but it's not predicated on just this like massive growth, massive scale is the only thing that we're shooting for. Another big macroeconomic, I say the main economic real challenge is that current system has almost no capacity to deal with long time horizons and the distribution of harm. So to say it more concretely, for example, solving climate change for people, especially poor people, 100 years in the future is very difficult to turn into a return on investment, to make a return on investment on that. It's very difficult to make money solving climate change for people 100 years in the future, let alone 1,000 years, right? Causing it is incredibly easy. Causing climate change is very easy to turn onto a return on investment today, to make money now by extracting from the future. And so that creates this huge power asymmetry, which is this time gap and the distribution gap. So the time gap meaning it just can't take in consideration long time periods, and in fact is hyper short-term focused. And then the distribution gap is that the harm that's caused is distributed to the future and distributed to many, many more people, where the benefit is reversed, where it's current in time and it's very, very focalized. Making money today is very focalized and very current. So and there's no mainstream economic model that can address that gap. And if we're not doing that, then it's not coherent. It's not going to be lasting. We'll end up with so many different distortions and challenges, and all we're doing is kicking the can down the road and making it much more difficult for people in the future. In our own life, to bring it more to the individual, my favorite statement that I think explains most global issues is the raindrop does not feel responsibility for the flood, right? And in many ways, our actions were enmeshed in a system that I would say is unethical. And so just by participating in it, just by existing, not even participating, just by existing, we inevitably participate in activities and organizations and things that are actually, if we inquired into it, are against our ethics, or we would not be, we would say are not in alignment with our spiritual values or principles. And that's part of just the trap of the modern age, is just to live and exist means to be participating in extractive structures. And there's no judgment. There's not to say that makes people, it's not bad people doing bad things, it's good people doing bad things. But the structure of the system itself prevents us from really living our lives in a way that's more holistic and that is regenerative, meaning that the way we just by existing is actually beneficial to life and beneficial to the ecology, versus extractive, which is it's taking from and it's stealing from the future and from others. And it's just important for us to have that recognition in a non-judgmental way, which also I think spirituality helps with, because it's very difficult to communicate that type of concept without someone taking on the ownership of blame or feeling like they're being attacked, where it's actually just a recognition of we participate in these structures inherently, and they're against our values, and that's okay. How do we build better structures that are more in alignment with what our ethics and values are? And it's interesting, there's lots of ways to do that. There's tons of different ways to build new structures and to have things function in a more regenerative manner. Does that get at some of what you're trying to get to? I could go more specifics around like how business and people, everyone's trying to grow their business, and that's fine.
Let's go into that.
Well, it depends on everything exists on multiple scales, right? And so, the challenges with something like Facebook are not the same thing as I'm sure the challenges of something like someone trying to grow their coaching business or someone trying to sell a particular product or service, right? There's so I think you have to draw somewhat of a categorical difference between different types of activities, but not to say that they're all neutral. So if you're, even if you're looking at farming, for example, if you're doing massive, kind of Monsanto style monoculture, is very different than doing more regenerative approaches or permaculture approaches that are a bit more holistic, perhaps more expensive, more time consuming, but in aggregate lead to very, very different results. And so it's just to say that not all business activity is equal in terms of value to society, in terms of ethics, and all these different manners. Then you have, let's say, with these large corporations or these large, especially let's use Facebook as an example, is they're operating under a certain set of pressures which drives them in particular directions. So, for example, one of the pressures of Facebook and many tech companies is screen time and getting people addicted to their phones, because that's how they make money, through advertising. And so the advertising business model that integrates with the technology, which is designed to just, get people as hooked as possibly can, is unethical, right? We would say, if you really inquired, and you say, well, this is unethical, but that's the model of how these companies make lots and lots of money, and turning us into the product rather than the consumer, or rather than the customer, so to speak. And so when you're dealing with organizations at that scale that are competing in this different manner and have all these pressures, it often guides us in these directions that are primarily profit focused or primarily focused on competition, and have a very difficult time even orienting around how are we providing for the broader benefit and good of society. It's not ultimately a question that really gets asked all that much. And then when it does, it often gets co-opted by those. And that's one of the hardest things, right? And that's one of the reasons, for example, I'm a little bit critical of the conscious capitalism movement. You have Amazon starting off as one of the original kind of progenitors of conscious capitalism, eventually Whole Foods, starting off as one of the original progenitors of conscious capitalism, and then eventually bought by Amazon. And it's the conglomeration, it's that directionality, which even the companies that are starting off with a values or an ethical basis, as they grow and they scale, they can have these distortions which push them in these particular directions. And once again, that's more of a systems issue than it is necessarily a greed issue that people are inherently greedy or bad, or they're running their companies wrong. It's the economic system incentivizes that and structured in a way where that's how you have to operate.
And that would be a traditional model, to build up your company and have it ready to sell. And then when you sell, then you have a cash out, you have a liquidity event, and then you're free for the rest of your life. And who would not want that as an individual or as a team or as an executive team? So this then boils right down, as I look at it, to the heart of our humanity, to the heart of our heart. And this, I want to ask you probably the toughest question, and then we'll go back around. And that is, I know you and your teams have been working on alternative and profound and regenerative models. But even with all of that, if the solutions are all there, how do we change the hearts? How do we elicit the hearts of those? Because to me, there's no such thing as corporations. There's just people. There's people in board offices, there's CEOs, there's executive teams. And it looks like there's a corporation, and we can see people on the ground floor. Look at that bad company, look at that bad company. But it's just people like you who are in front of their computer right now. In front of their room right now, making decisions with other people. How can we get those? How do we speak to them so that they can see the bigger picture? They can see the detriment of a infinite growth paradigm, and that their extrapolative, ideology is eventually going to kill their grandchildren. I mean, like, is anyone getting across to them the harshness of what the ramifications are down the road? And that's, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, so there's two pieces there. It's kind of like, what is the sociopathology of a corporation if it's just a group of people? How are they engaging in this type of behavior that is, I really like this term, defuturing. It's removing the capability of having a futuring, right? It's limiting that. And rather than future enabling and multiple future enabling.
Yes.
And I'm gonna kind of disagree with you a little bit that a corporation is not. Corporations as legal entities do have specific statutes and specific things that are important. Like when they invented limited liability corporations, LLCs, like you see that it's in the title. It's limited liability. It's removing. So, for example, if you removed that, if you said no, you're liable for these actions. And if that's actually changes the incentive structure quite significantly. People might act differently regardless of their hearts and minds.
I see.
So
because their loyalty is to the mandate of the company.
Well, a company. So I agree with you. A corporation is just a group of people, but it's also it's a legal entity, and you can have different kinds of mandates within different kinds of legal entities. And I think one of the fundamental distinctions is, let me put it this way, is for a long time we've created this dichotomy between nonprofit and for-profit. And nonprofit, it's do good, and for-profit, it's maximize shareholder value or make as much money, whatever it is. And the dichotomy is false. We need to be outcomes focused. We need to have institutions and organizations that are just saying, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and what is the best means to achieve that outcome, and how are we resourcing and building capability for that? that's getting people way more in alignment with dharma and purpose than I'm working for this corporation and I'm doing my job because my boss tells me so, and I'm not really connected to it, but it pays my bills, and so therefore I'm going to keep doing it. Or I don't have a choice, or I feel trapped. And so there's a kind of economic emancipation that really needs to take place so that people are able to spend their time in alignment with deeper purpose and meaning and things that actually provide for the broader benefit. But the current structure actually in many ways doesn't enable, it's limiting of that. It's not enabling of it. And that has to do a lot with so many things, the way that taxes are structured, the way that our policies are structured, the way that corporations, the mandates of corporations are structured, the finance system. Like, there's all of this infrastructure that provides that directionality as it currently exists, which is mostly to grow and make money, versus if you're saying, how are we achieving particular outcomes? How are we solving climate change? How are we regenerating the soils? It follows a very different kind of logic and model. The challenge is, or not the challenge, one of the many challenges is actually the financing, right? So, if you look at technology, for example, there's this whole venture capital space. And like you said a moment ago, there's this whole pipeline of people raising money and then raising more money. And then they have a liquidity event or they sell their company. So that creates this whole specific railroad tracks of how you're supposed to build these things. And it's set for you ahead of time, and it's very difficult to be successful out of that path. It's very difficult to raise money. It's very difficult for people to understand what you're trying to do. Where a lot of the people that are focused more on broader good and regenerative approaches and holistic models, like I said, it's much harder to turn that into an ROI. Right? It's just more difficult because the value of it is distributed to more people and in the future. And so a lot of it comes down to it's not only the hearts and minds, I think that's important, but it's literally just the investment. How are we building organizations from the corporate structure, from the economic structure, from the financial structure, the legal structure, that just look very, very different? To your specific questions about the hearts and minds and whether people are aware, I think I've always been perplexed by that. So I'm not necessarily the best person to answer that, because I've always been quite confused how people are participating in activities which in some cases are quite sociopathic. And there's some really interesting dynamics for how that takes place. There's a famous quote of, I'm going to butcher it, but it's basically, don't expect someone to understand something that the way they make their paycheck is predicated on them not understanding it, right? So there's a certain amount, which is, if you try to point to something, but it's contradictory with someone's worldview or the way that they make money or the way that they're justifying their actions, it prevents people from actually seeing what you're speaking to. So I think that's one issue. Another issue is this, and a number of people like Daniel Schmachtenberger talk about this, how the structures kind of breed different kinds of pathological, psychological structures. So, for example, why do we have a narcissist as president? Right? Why do we have more percentage-wise more sociopaths in C-suites? People who are lacking in empathy, who are lacking in some of those dynamics. That's structural. It's designed to enable that, and especially within certain area segments that are quite powerful. Let's say a lot of the finance industry. There's a certain amount of changing hearts and minds. There's a certain amount of, I don't think that some people, I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to paint with too broad a brushstroke, but in my experience, especially within certain segments of the economy, there's just not an ethical basis to it whatsoever. And and so there's just not that connection between the actions that I'm doing and the repercussions of that, especially for people that are abstract, that are in the future or future generations. I have seen a lot of that change over the years, but I haven't seen it be integrated. You have, even over the past couple of years, I witnessed the growth of, an expansion of impact investment and socially responsible investing. And over the past couple of years, people like Larry Fink saying how they're taking climate into consideration with all their investments. But unfortunately, it's still quite surface level and not questioning the growth paradigm or not questioning some of these really deeper assumptions around the way that economics and finance is structured. And so it's not moving past some of the inherent contradictions of the current model that are self-terminating. It's perpetuating them, but with like slightly less bad. That was a lot.
There's a lot, and I'm just feeling through all the layers here. And as you were sharing, I was coming back to what I feel or consider one of the main errors that we have in business, and that is right down to the core, as you said, an incorporation, a limited liability. We've taken a non-human, and in the legal realm, we've infused them with having a soul. We've incorporated them. We've given them a corporation, a body, and we made it equal to someone who has a soul, someone who has a spirit. To
More
some
important.
degree. What's that?
More important. It's more important than
so
individuals.
It's even more elevated than humanity. We've turned a fictional entity into something which, in the law system, which is how we're governing our exchanges through that modality or holding it in that sphere, I see that as a foundational, fundamental. That is it's pathological, because it's something that's not real can become real in law and be given all these protections and not take liability. Then those who are operating within that system can get away with anything in the name of their company, which has no liability. Is there a movement? Is there a direction to take away the concept of an incorporated company? Because I see that as a fundamental spiritual assault, which is at the root of much of this. The extrapolation goes from there. If you can be an inhuman, a non-human, then that non-human has we don't even, by its nature, is sociopathological. It doesn't have empathy.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of sides to that. There are people that have pushed back against like limited liability companies, but it's never gained any traction that I've seen. More so what historically, there's been a movement of people moving towards like benefit corporation, B Corps, more kind of social good type ventures where it's embedded in the charters of the companies. And I think that's all perfectly fine and good. It's certainly a step in the right direction, but that's kind of it's not trying to get rid of corporations, it's trying to make them, operate by a slightly different metric and standard. There's another direction, which is really interesting and tougher, and that's a lot more where we focus on, which is on the commons. And this is something, maybe I could try to communicate it succinctly, is people, if you want to read more about this, there's a great book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And one of the things that she points to that I really appreciate is people think of an economy as the relationship between the market and the state. And actually, it's four primary areas. It's the market, the state, the household, and the commons. So the household there's all sorts of activity and value that's created by us taking care of each other and taking care of the kids and cooking together and, being in family and being community. It's different than going to a restaurant and there's a market exchange when you go to a restaurant, but there's not a market exchange when you're cooking dinner for your family, besides buying the products if you do. And so it's something like, and also, for example, all of the work and labor that running a household, that that women and men do raising kids and running a household is like something like a third of GDP that's not measured. That's all this activity. So that's one area. It's just the value of households and communities, which largely has been over time kind of usurped by the market. Because it's better to go under that orientation. It's better to send your kids to daycare than it is to have the communities raise them together, or better to go to a restaurant rather than cook for your family. In the commons section, the commons are things which are held in common, which are, the atmosphere is held in commons, many of the waterways, many of the land resources. There's intellectual commons, there's social commons. There's a really great book called Free, Fair, and Alive by David Boyer that goes into this quite well. And that is the kind of orientation that's actually needed right now, but it's a completely different worldview. It requires what's called an ontological shift. And so, for example, the movements on like the rights of nature. So that why is you're saying we're creating this legal entity around a corporation and making that up, but why does a forest not have its rights to its own sovereignty and existence, right? That is a real thing. That is how
Yes.
that is part of the, and we're, once again, the market orientation is that it's best privatized and it's best as a product. Right. So taking a tree and all the millions of complex things that the tree does and chopping it down and turning it to lumber is where the value is. There's no value inherently in the tree, but that's not actually true. There is that inherent value in the trees and the forests and the water, but it's not oriented from a worldview perspective because we've been essentially trained out of it. And so to your question about, is there a movement to abolishing corporations? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but it's not getting much traction. I focus more on how are we actually creating protections and in legal structures and ontological structures around the commons, the things that we all share and actually do really exist and are being quite threatened across many domains, many more than people even recognize. Does that get a little bit of what you're saying?
It does. Thank you. Yeah, it does. Let's go to the natural, what I consider the natural outcome of the current system as a whole, which is, in my opinion, crash. We cannot keep going in this way. We cannot continue to consume. We don't have infinite resources on this planet. We have finite resources. When we started the industrial age, we thought we had resources for thousands of years, and thus that all started. And because we're quite smart, technologically intelligent Homo sapiens, we've created an incredible burst and growth of consumption. We've raised the standard of living in many ways in the Western worlds, at least, not in other parts of the world. Third worlds, many of them are still suffering. But ultimately, it cannot go on, just mathematically.
Yeah.
When do you think this is going to crash? And so, number one, when do you think we by the weight of its own consumption, it'll crash? And should we let it crash? Is my next question. And then, like, should we let the whole thing crash and burn? It's going that ways, anyways. There's lots there in myself on an emotional feeling level, and I really don't know, because there's a part of me there's a part of me truly that thinks the people, the CEOs, the leadership teams and companies that I work with are progressive, they're awake, they're interested in human potential, they're interested in ontological shifts, they have a calling to be more Gaia-centric. And I don't know if I'm just working with those rare people because I happen to be in those realms. But so that's what's going on. So I'm going to dump that in your hands.
It's the crux of a few very difficult questions. I've been trying to do research on crisis and collapse for a long time because, and I mentioned this to you last time we spoke, is generally there's only three modes of transformation. There's spontaneous miracles, right? Spontaneous awakening. There's incremental through deliberate practice and process, and then there's through crisis and collapse. And even on an individual level, most people choose or end up in crisis and collapse. Right? There's very few instances of it happens, but the kind of spontaneous awakening is relatively rare. And then incrementally, you really have to have a dedication and a practice and support structures and teachers. And so even that's quite, so most people transform through crisis. So oftentimes they'll hit rock bottom before, and some obviously don't make it through. Then when you extrapolate that to an organizational layer, it's similar. Most times you can have incremental transformation, but it oftentimes also happens through crisis. And then on a societal level, unless it's a very, very developed society, I mean, it primarily changes through crisis and collapse. And so the transformation is kind of embedded in that type of trajectory. You were asking for timelines, which is, I don't think it's one. I think we're going through a series of crises and collapse over a period of time. I don't think it's one categorical event. We're going through one right now, obviously. And what's interesting is it's highlighting a lot of the challenges in the current structure, right? Especially it's really bringing a lot of globalization into question, which is really quite fascinating. I will say that there's the work of Friedrich Capra showed this to me in this book, The Systems View of Life, which is quite wonderful, and studying the environment, is you have what's called overshoot and collapse, meaning you cross the ecological boundaries, but there's a gap in time. So it seems like things are still relatively stable, but then you have a precipitous decline quite quickly. And I will say that it's more than likely that we've already passed, that we're in that window. We're in the overshoot and collapse type window. So we're probably not going to do massive things to really mitigate climate change, for example. And also not even climate change, but we're not in a climate crisis, we're in an ecological crisis across multiple domains of the biosphere, right? So we're probably not going to address many of those. And so you'll have this overshoot and collapse where you've exceeded those boundaries, but there's a time lag, and we're in the time lag right now. And then there'll be more of a precipitous decline is the nature of how that goes. So, and I don't mean that in any kind of fearful way or trying to be, sometimes I think that can bring up an anxiety with folks, but I don't mean it in that context. It's just really
I'm hoping it brings up the greatest amount of anxiety, quite frankly, because as you said, many of us are drawn into a call to action. We demand of our leaders to change when we see in our face that the tidal wave is about to hit us. Many times we're not moved until the anxiety gets to the point, and the reality, if you will, because there's a huge veil of illusion, drunkenness, if you will, adolescent view, energetic holding of our leadership, thinking that they're figuring all this stuff out. They're going to start making things happen. We don't have to worry about the macro. I can just keep my head buried in my day-to-day life. And that's no longer the case.
No. Well, there's no adults in the room. There's no one that's actually running the show anymore. And I don't know if there ever really was. And so it really requires taking on more of an individual sovereignty, because the structures that we're kind of pointing to and saying, well, surely these people must be focused on this and figuring it out. The more that you spend time in those environments, like there's no adults in the room. The question about whether you should try to stop the crisis or collapse, or on the opposite side try to precipitate it, I think you could take different positions. My personal position is trying to focus on ahimsa or nonviolence. So I don't think it's appropriate to try to precipitate crisis. I think it's doing that on its own. Preventing crisis or collapse is certainly worthwhile, especially in terms of buying time and addressing issues. And there's lots of things that we can address quite effectively now, and that oftentimes too. I'm not trying to paint a picture that on crisis and collapse on the other side it leads to something better. It's more than likely leads to something that's worse, or it's dual arising, meaning you have lots of better and lots of worse simultaneously.
Yes.
So I certainly don't advocate for precipitating it. I personally don't spend a huge amount of time focused on how are we preventing it, more so because I see the inherent contradictions so clearly that I don't think that in many cases they're surmountable. So all you can really do is just kick the can down the road. And I personally, given limited time and bandwidth, want to focus on what comes next and what kind of structures can we build and what can we do now to enable those kinds of structures. So just as an example.
So in other words,
Yeah.
building whatever is next, creating it, stabilizing it now, so as this is crumbling or crashing, that we can make a more easeful transition into something that's more wholesome and Omni-Win.
Yeah, as much as possible. Building capacity and infrastructure is really where I focus, and it's very difficult. I'm not trying to claim that we're doing a great job at it more broadly because of some of the issues that I illustrated, because people aren't there yet from an ontological or an epistemological perspective. So it's difficult for, I've worked in the philanthropic space for a while, and most of the wealth that's out there is not oriented in these directions, and they're kind of behind the curve. And so building the kind of capacity and infrastructure for new models, even if they're very small, even if they're little prototypes or experiments, that's where I choose to focus my time, because I'm a little bit, it's my disposition, and it's something I understand more. And also, it's like you see something that's just not working, and you can try to tweak at the edges, but you just know, going back to what you were talking about before, the legal system, there's so much regulatory capture, there's so much that's just become enmeshed in the legal system that I'm like, well, this is ridiculous, or it's just going to lead to these terrible things. And then you're like, okay, well, how do you change the Constitution? Or how do you change it into, like, there's not really an activity to do there. It's not really feasible as an action, both because it goes so far against mainstream orientation and these like founding sacred types of concepts and documents, and then also just the mechanism by which you would make those changes is so insurmountable that it's not that it's not worth engaging with that and trying to do what you can, but the contradictions within the system are so pronounced and so self-terminating that I'd rather just try to focus on what's building next and let those systems play themselves out, rather than having a tsunami coming at me and trying to, like, with a bucket trying to like just try to hold it back. I don't see how I could make any type of difference in it. And that's not a nihilistic perspective, actually. And I know people who are engaging the current system and doing incredible work, and it's super important. So I don't mean to be disparaging to that kind of work at all. It's just not where I orient.
This is exactly where I was going to go next. And that's coming right back to home, to you, to the good folks who are really caring about the shift into a better reality for the whole. How are you guys managing the internal shit, if you will, of how do we deal with so many problems on so many levels, so many avenues? How do you deal with that emotionally? How do you deal with that spiritually? Because you're dealing with these macro issues. We're all dealing with our own internal everyday issues. As humans, what internal shifts are you taking, the circles you're taking, to be able to face what seems impossible?
Yeah. I used to be much worse at it. If you knew me, even a few years ago, but really 10 years ago when I was in this space, especially coming to an understanding as late 20s, early 30s, seeing, okay, there's no adults in the room, and the people that are pretending to be adults are still engaging in a very surface level. They're not actually getting at the roots of these issues. That caused a real crisis for me when I was younger, and kind of made me feel like, well, all right, well, then we have to do it. We have to be the adults, or we have to take it all on. And it actually was quite crippling. And I just had the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I was physically impaired and unhealthy because I just was banging my head against the wall. And I think I still struggle with it, but one of the things that shifted, well, I don't know how long ago, but a few years ago, was studying. I read this book by Stephen Cope, The Great Work of Your Life, I think is what it's called. And it was looking at all these historical figures from the perspective of the Bhagavad Gita. And he was basically saying, the Bhagavad Gita, this is his premise. I generally agree with it. He was like, it's basically saying, know your purpose, do it full out, let go of the result, and orient as it all as a gift to God, as a gift to others. And that's very much my orientation, in that most of the things that I spend my time on, I don't think will ultimately be effective, or not effective, but I don't have a guarantee that they'll work, and I don't really care. And I can't say that I think that we're going to emerge from the other side of all of this, and it's probably going to take a long period of time, and it's going to be, very painful for a lot of people. It already is. We're already feeling that. So it's being really real with the nature of truth, the nature of what the world is right now, and the pain and the suffering and the joy and the beauty and both sides of it, being able to hold both sides. And so I think part of it is, how do you build your container so you can hold the shadow and the light, and be able to just hold both sides of it within yourself and embrace both sides even. And then the other is, going back to what I was saying about the Gita, is just do the work and show up and do your best and have strategy and have goals and be effective. But if you're orienting it as you're just trying to be in service, if you're just trying to be helpful, it's not as much of this, like, I have to, like, I'm not trying to change the world. I'm not trying to make an impact. I'm just trying to be of service and be helpful in ways that make sense to me. And if I'm blessed by God, then some of that will come through. And if not, then that's okay too. Does that make sense?
I think this is the eternal response and answer that Lord Krishna gave to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Like, do your thing, do it fully, do it without reservation, do it without fear, do it knowing that the outcome will never be in your hands, and you can't count on any outcome. Although that's a very strong attachment, especially if we're doing good in the world and we want our world to survive in a whole new way. We want, a flourishing society for all peoples. These are very noble and very high values and virtues to hold. And to say, hey, don't have an attachment to that. That's mine at least, biggest challenge in continuous processing, inner work, and continuous inner practice of surrender. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing, and your team, and all the good care and conscientiousness that you're doing in worlds that are so far removed from many of us, but need to be addressed. I'm very grateful on behalf of the Word Sage community. Is there anything in your heart to complete today, to share, that leaves us, that's in your heart to share, to express?
Just on that last point you were saying of, the non-attachment is not an excuse for non-doing. And, I would love it if some of the things that we're working on could really proliferate and scale, because there are a lot of really good ideas and things like that I think would be quite beneficial if we were able to really, to build these. And I think that those visions of the world that you're speaking to are in many ways still feasible, and for many, many people. But it really, going back to what I said, the raindrop does not feel responsibility for the flood. The flip side is also true, is if you really have many, many people waking up and showing up and participating, that what's possible far exceeds what we're currently contemplating, what we're currently thinking as even in the realm of possibility. There's so much more infinite capacity that we have, but it requires stepping into that space just with our visions and our thinking and our purpose, and then enabling, when I was talking about that economic emancipation, like enabling people to be more in their purpose, more in the dharma, and contributing to those broader visions. And that's what I'd love to see happen, because I think it's perfectly feasible. But it requires a change in priorities and a change of structures and a change of resourcing and decision making. And we're kind of, we're stuck in a particular path, but that path is eventually gonna, continue to crumble, and so we get to choose a new path. And I'm really happy to be in this path with you, on to build greater coherence and greater wholes.
Oh, how can our friends get in touch with you, your organization?
I'm not even sure if we have their website up quite yet. It's been working on. My email is evan@oneproject.org. If folks want to reach out, just it's the easiest way, either by Facebook or shooting me an email. I'm always, as you can tell, I can talk about all this stuff at great length, so I'm always happy to connect with people that are interested in it.
Thank you, brother. You shared during this chat here the 3 potential ways that we can evolve. We can experience enlightenment, we can shift in society, micro, macro level. One of them was when shit hits the fan, when we're at the rock bottom, and it's like, okay, either now I change or I die. Okay, so that's number 1. Okay, and we're on that trajectory, and we can use that as motivation. We can absorb, and we can sit in the anxiety of it, we can sit in the fear of it, and rather than collapse in it, we can utilize and springboard that fear, that angst, that anxiety, that like, what the heck are we doing? And instead of going into the realms of violence upon self, through apathy, through non-activity, through just blinding our eyes and thinking only about personal survival, or going the other way into vehemency and marching against and being against and aiming to break down the system. I mean, there's the effects of all of that, and all of that always usually has some type of balancing force that eats up and never fulfills the outcome that was originally intended in the heart. Then you said, then there's the other method of incremental change. And I believe we need to all do that, each and every one of us, however we're motivated, moved. What is our dharma? What's ours to do? Knowing now that we are part of this whole macro whole. We're not just the drop. We are the drop that accumulates to become the wave that becomes a tsunami. And in my soul of souls, I'm also holding out for option 3, which is the miracle and transformation in consciousness. I have seen the most hardened CEOs in my work, the most egocentric, self-absorbed, narcissistic, greedy CEOs, leadership teams transform in front of my eyes. They've had miracles happen through unique experiences, through being challenged in certain ways, crack open, through ceremonies, plant ceremonies, through meditative absorptions, when given the edge and the push, okay, I'll do it. But it comes in from an egoic reason. They want to have more peace of mind so that they can make more profit. They want to be more centered so they can be higher peak performers. But what comes out of it is the miracle, is they recognize peak performance is killing themselves. And I think now we need to move into the next era of business leadership, going from peak performance to peak existence, being the hallmark. Peak existence for self, peak existence for the all.
I agree. That's your gift, is that you can guide all 3 of those processes. I don't know anybody else really that can take people that far through all 3 of those scenarios as quick as you can. So it's really one of the main reasons why your work is so important right now.
My brother, thank you so much for sharing today, your heart, your continuous commitment. I love you, and we'll jam again soon. Okay. Thank you, friends, everyone, for joining. All right.